All right, this is new information, very new information, and I'm really excited to talk about it. And we're getting more and more all the time. And I can't imagine that any of you ever want Alzheimer's. And this is the first time in research that I've ever heard any researchers say we now think Alzheimer's is preventable in most cases. So I'm planning to prevent it for me. So I'd like you to get on board that train too. All right, let's go. Albert Schweitzer. Amazing man. No, I did not ever meet him, but I certainly wish I could have. He said, each patient carries his own doctor inside him. We are at our best when we give the doctor who resides within a chance to go to work. So the question is, who's the doctor within? So if you use this metaphor, every one of us is a patient, everyone. And the doctor within is the brain and body's immune system. Now, this is kind of interesting because up until 2016, nobody believed the brain had an immune system. All of the textbooks only had pictures of the immune system up to as far as the neck. Nobody thought there was any immune system in the brain. Well, there are. So we've got the immune system vessels throughout the body, miles and miles and miles and miles of them. And we have the glymphatic system, which is the title for the immune system in the brain. When, in 2016, Dr. Kipnis was working with graduate students in his lab, and one of them came to him and said, I don't understand what I'm seeing on this brain. Would you come and look at it for me? I don't know what these vessels are. And because we get better and better at electronics, Dr. Kipnis looked at it and he said, you have just discovered an immune vessel in the brain, and we didn't think there were any there. And he said, now we're going to have to rush around and change all of the textbooks. Because if you look at any textbooks in the past, you will see nothing in the brain that has to do with the immune system. And now you can see it all around there. So, inflammation. How does that now correlate with the immune system in the brain? You pretty well have all heard of inflammation, I'm quite sure. Anybody not heard of inflammation? Good. It is defined as a built-in defense mechanism against irritants or injury. And it comes from the Latin verb inflammare, meaning to set on fire. So if you have cut your finger badly, and it's been stitched, but it still begins to swell and get red and hot, that's the immune system healing that cut. A Roman guy who authored a book called De Medicina, which translated is On Medicine, was the first person to describe the 4 most common symptoms with inflammation. And they are: inflammation is redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And for years and years and years, those were the only 4 symptoms. And then we had a German scientist who added a 5th sign, the loss of function. Meaning when your finger is hot and red and painful and swollen, you can't bend it like you used to. So those since 1871 have remained the 4 main inflammation symptoms. Now, here's the good news. The reason it swells and gets hot is because the immune system is flooding that area with white blood cells to help repair the injury. And because there's more cells getting crammed into that space, it swells. And of course, when it swells, it hurts. But that's how you heal. And it's amazing to me. You know, some people heal faster than others depending on what kind of lifestyle they're living. But you can get a bad cut, and in a week or 10 days, you wouldn't even know it was there. It's such an efficient healing system if you're healthy. But here's the bad news. The immune system is able to run off the track. Many things might cause it to do that. But when it runs off of the rails, as I like to say, it launches an attack on the self, meaning it misidentifies part of your own body as an invader. And that's horrible because it causes generalized inflammation all over the body. And that leads to autoimmune diseases and many chronic illnesses. I'll show you a few of them. Diseases that are based on chronic inflammation are the most significant cause of illness and death worldwide. 70% of non-communicable diseases involve chronic inflammation. And we did not know that. 3 of every 5 individuals around the world who die do so from a disease that's been linked with inflammation. That's huge. If chronic inflammation could be done away with, 90% of heart disease, strokes, and diabetes, along with 40% of cancers and some dementias, would be preventable. That's how egregious it is when you get generalized inflammation. What factors increase your risk for developing generalized inflammation? I just brought 7 of them. Number 1, high body mass index in the obesity range. Nobody likes to be told that they could probably lose a few pounds and prevent a lot of illness. But it's linked with more than 50 chronic conditions just from the World Health Organization. So what is your range of healthy weight for your size, bone structure, and so on? Figure that out and make it happen, because it's the number 1 risk for chronic inflammation. 2, excessively high intensive exercise. People that go to the gym and they go like crazy, hour after hour after hour, or they run a marathon every week because exercise is good for us. Well, everything that has to do with the balance, the brain works better in balance. So not enough exercise is lethal. Too much exercise is also lethal. So it's all about, are you living a balanced longevity lifestyle? 3, prolonged sitting with your legs hanging down, because that puts a lot of stress on the body to keep the blood pumping back to the brain. So if I want to work at home on my computer, I have a lounge chair that comes up so that I'm sitting flat. And I still need to get up and walk around, but at least my legs are not hanging down. 4, mental or emotional stress. A lot of people are mentally and emotionally stressed, but that has to do with the mindset. And you can choose to be really stressed, or you can choose not to be really stressed, unless you have a mental disorder. And in fact, chronic mental disorders do tend to increase a person's risk for inflammation. Number 5, alcohol intake, as it is a brain toxin. What keeps people drinking is because the moment they take a sip of alcohol, the brain recognizes it as a toxin and it doesn't like it. So it pours out endorphins trying to compensate for this toxin. And there's nobody on planet Earth that knows. I mean, if you could drink a few sips and get all of these endorphins and then stop, if you wanted to drink, that would be the way to drink. But there's not a brain on the planet that knows when you've reached that corner, if you will. So they keep drinking. But the extra endorphins don't help. So people ask me, Arlene, do you drink? And I go, yeah, hydrogen water, but I certainly don't drink alcohol. Well, what happens when you go to a wedding and they pass out, champagne? Isn't it disrespectful to the couple if you don't drink? I said, I just get a glass of water. They don't care what's in my glass, for heaven's sake, but I care what's in my glass. 6, frequent colds and flus as they trigger inflammation. And you know how you feel when you have a bad cold or a bad flu. You just feel horrible. And that's because the immune system is just running all over through your body trying to get these white blood cells going to help you get better. But it can often turn into chronic inflammation. And 7, something called metabolic syndrome. I'm sure you've heard of that, but you may not realize what it is. Estimates are 1 in 4 individuals in this country already have metabolic syndrome. And it includes high blood pressure, high blood sugar, and abdominal obesity. And this is particularly lethal for males. So males, if you have abdominal obesity, make it your number 1 choice to get rid of it. Because not only does abdominal obesity increase inflammation, but it lowers your testosterone level and raises your estrogen level. And most of the men I talk to really don't have any desire to have higher estrogen levels. They really like to have a lot of testosterone. Well, it's directly linked with abdominal fat. So those are things you can do to lower that. All right, I wanted just to show you the conditions that involve inflammation. And this is only 26 of them. The general rule is if it ends in itis, itis, it's largely due to inflammation. And so you can just go down the list: appendicitis, arthritis, bronchitis, cellulitis, cholecystitis, conjunctivitis, cystitis, and so on and so forth. All of those have general inflammation underlying them. So if you can clean up the generalized inflammation, you have a good chance of perhaps avoiding most of these. There are some genetic components, but remember, genetics only influences 30% of how well and how long you live. 70% is epigenetics, which is everything that's not genetics. Everything has to do with the kind of lifestyle you're living, all of the risk factors we just talked about, and so on and so forth. And almost all of those risk factors as adults, you have complete or at least partial control over. So running around and saying the devil made me eat that whole cake is ridiculous. The devil didn't make you do nothing. You chose what you're going to eat. And that's part of a lifestyle. All right, Alzheimer's disease. It's a progressive neurodegenerative disease, meaning it destroys parts of the brain. Its main symptoms are memory loss, confusion, a decline in cognitive functions. Cognitive just means the way you're able to think, and changes in behavior and personality. It's an ugly disease. Nobody wants Alzheimer's. It is a dementia. There's a whole group of dementias. But if you think of, I carry around my, little bag with my computer in and so on, but it's got several pockets. If you consider my whole little bag as dementia, the biggest chunk, the biggest section in that is Alzheimer's. But there are many kinds of dementia. You don't want any of them, but you especially don't want Alzheimer's. So what are the typical risk factors that you would have that might increase your ability or your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's? Well, the typical one is a parent or a sibling that had Alzheimer's disease. Because remember, 30% of how well and how long you live has to do with lifestyle, has to do with genetics. And your parent or sibling who has Alzheimer's may have some genetic components, but they could still have genetic components. But if you are living a longevity lifestyle, you have reduced those. And so you don't have as big a risk just because somebody in your family developed it. Diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes has a lot to do with genetics. Type 2 is almost totally a lifestyle disease. Midlife hypertension or high blood pressure, physical inactivity. You need some, you just don't want to overdo it. Smoking, and here we go again, midlife obesity. Nobody's exactly sure why obesity increases inflammation so much throughout the body, but we know that it does. So if there's one thing that you could concentrate on, it's keeping your weight in the range for your size. I come from a family that has the West Coast concession on obesity. There may be a female relative of mine that's an inch taller, but that may be because she's got heels on. But they're all about my size, and not one of them weighs less than 180 pounds. So as I began to look at this, going through nursing school and so on, I thought, well, look how many of them have heart problems, look how many of them have diabetes. I am going to make a different choice. And so I consistently am very careful about keeping my weight within the range that's recommended for my height, bone structure, and so on. And it's not hard to do, it's a mindset. And people are now saying preventing chronic inflammatory diseases involves a mindset. You're going to do it or aren't you? And if you've got some familial genetics, sometimes epigenetics can even override genetics, but it takes choice. There is a strong, and we talked about the relationship between inflammation and dementia. There's a clear link in Alzheimer's between generalized inflammation and Alzheimer's. It's been demonstrated in study after study after study. There's handfuls of research using mice and rats, which is how this started, because the mice and rat brain are very much like our brains. In fact, they have 30 of the very same neuropeptides. So when you get clear research with mice and rats, pretty good chance that it's the same thing's going to happen for humans. It's just we can't do the kind of studies on humans that we could do on rats, because you can make a plan for an adult and tell them this is what you need to do, but it's personal choice. With mice and rats, you can control what they eat and what they drink and how much they sleep when the lights go out and stuff like that. You can't really do that with adults, because they want to do what they want, when they want to do it, and how they want to do it. And it's lethal when it comes to chronic diseases. You've heard of glial cells, right? How many have heard of glial cells? One? Oh, I'm glad you're here. All right. Glial cells, let's say that you're a president of an organization. You don't run that organization by yourself. You've probably got an executive assistant, you've probably got some vice presidents, you've probably got managers. Think of everybody but the president as a glial cell. So every neuron in your brain has a bunch of glial cells that support it. They make food for it, they take away waste products, all kinds of things. They're hugely important. In the AIDS epidemic, about 20% of people who got AIDS had brain involvement. Not everybody did, but about 20%. And they thought, wow, you know, that little virus is really gung-ho at killing all these neurons. And then they began to realize, as they did post-mortem examinations on those brains of the people who died, especially with the AIDS and brain involvement, the neurons were all dead, but that's because the glial cells all died. The neurons died not because of the virus. The neurons died because all of their helpers died. Just like a president of an organization, if everybody left, there's no way he or she can run that alone. So the neurons starved to death. And if people had only known that and figured a way to keep the glial cells alive, we wouldn't have had the millions and millions and millions of deaths that we did. So the glial cells have to do with keeping the environment good, keeping the house clean. You got a permanent housekeeper, which appeals to me a lot. When I finally retire, I am getting a housekeeper, because I do not have any interest whatsoever in keeping the environment clean. I've got much more important, interesting things to do, so I will have a housekeeper, and I will love that housekeeper. So the glial cells support the neurons, and they maintain the whole environment. And that top little picture on the right, they are the smallest of all the microglia. The microglia are a family of cells. And the glial cells are the tiniest ones in that family. They are definitely part of the immune system in the brain and the central nervous system, which involves, you know, the spinal cord and so on and so forth. There's another type of glial cells called astrocytes, and that's a picture of an astrocyte in the lower right. They help form the blood-brain barrier that keeps things from crossing and going into the brain. They're vital. They build this complex barrier and maintain it, and without them, there gets to be holes in that barrier, which allows things to cross that shouldn't get to the brain. They make the food for the neurons. They're called neurotrophins. The food is. They recycle neurotransmitters. There's only a couple of places that we know of in the brain that will make new neurons. Most of us have the neurons that we had after about the first year of life when the brain was done creating them. Same ones. But how you take care of your brain makes a difference on whether those neurons are still healthy, because you're not going to get enough remade new ones to keep you going. So they recycle neurotransmitters that are the substances that let the neurons talk to each other. And so they regularly recycle them. It's like, you know, your car gets a new engine every few years, you know, not necessarily the body's still great, but new engine. So they recycle the neurotransmitters, and they prune the synapses, you know, the space between the neurons, synaptic gap. And they make sure that it's a healthy synapse and you're using it. And if you stop using it, they may abolish it altogether because the brain goes, why should we keep this in the brain? They're not using it. They're not reading out loud 10 minutes a day. Let's get rid of those particular synapses. Not something I'm interested in doing. So here's a little slide I found that talks about inflammation. So you notice on the left, there's that box. If you have type 1 diabetes, the bottom line for that particular disease in that particular type of diabetes, it doesn't have enough insulin. The pancreas is not putting out enough insulin, period. And so someone with type 1 diabetes has to take insulin or they'll die. Type 2 diabetes, the body's putting out insulin, but the cells are resistant to it. And that leads to inflammation. And eventually, if people don't take care of themselves, type 2 diabetes will end up becoming type 1 diabetes, and they'll have to take insulin the rest of their lives. Now, they're talking about type 3 diabetes. And type 3 diabetes has a problem with metabolizing insulin resistance, and inflammation. And what do? They target the microglia and the astrocytes we just talked about. And they damage them and wipe them out. So that's why type 3 diabetes is being called Alzheimer's disease, which is pretty scary. All right. I have a fat thumb. Sometimes it puts two of them forward. And I have to thank Anita for this, because I didn't want to keep running over and trying to find a key on the laptop, which has happened to me a couple of times. People had no remote, so I'm trying to do this and run over and find a key to push. It's so much better. Okay, National Institute on Aging. In most cases, Alzheimer's disease does not have a single genetic cause. There is a higher risk, we've already said that, if a parent or a sibling has it. But Alzheimer's is influenced by a variety of types of genes combined with lifestyle and environmental factors. And I already mentioned that genetics is only 30% or less. Lifestyle is 70%. Recent studies have identified specific factors that can increase inflammation. Avoiding those factors may slow down inflammation and therefore the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And for most people, read my lips, it will require a change in lifestyle choices. But this is the first time that we've got any indication that it might be preventable. So lifestyle changes, what does that mean? Here's just one study, 35-year study, just released. Individuals who followed at least 4 of just 5 healthier habits showed a 60% lower risk or level of dementia or the cognitive decline with aging than if it wasn't Alzheimer's, it might be another dementia. What were the 5 habits that they were asked to avoid? Number 1, use regular exercise, no smoking, and that's cigars, cigarettes, vaping. Maintain a healthy body weight, that shows up over and over and over again. Eat a healthy diet, and we now know primarily what a healthy diet includes. And they have low or no alcohol drinks. Just with 4 of those, any 4, they reduced their level of getting a dementia or Alzheimer's by 60%. That is very, very good news. I am not going to ask you how many of those factors you're doing or not doing, but 35 years study is pretty interesting. Now, let's break it all down to lifestyle. So recent studies, and some of these studies are just a week old, they have shown a dozen things that are now believed to contribute to your risk of developing Alzheimer's. Now, I've gone through these, and it's pretty easy to dump them out of your life, but you just have to be vigilant. So we're going to go through those 12. Number 1, avoid high fructose corn syrup. Did you all know about high fructose corn syrup? Okay, which means that when you go shopping, you've got to take a magnifying glass because the manufacturers want to sell products. And high fructose corn syrup is really, really cheap. And they'd rather throw that in than pay for, refined sugar even. Now, sugar, is half fructose, half glucose. So that's why you got to be so careful of how much actual sugar you get. But here are some of the names that because they have to put something on the list of ingredients. Here are the names that they've come up with to substitute for high fructose corn syrup. Maize syrup, glucose fructose syrup, tapioca syrup, fruit fructose, corn syrup, crystalline fructose, isoglucose, and dahlia syrup. Now, who would know? Who would know? 2, avoid artificial sweeteners, period. No more dumping that artificial stuff in your tea or coffee. And minimize table sugar because it's half fructose. And fructose seems to be involved with the development of the tangles in the brain that are so common in Alzheimer's disease. Avoid fried foods and anything barbecued. Barbecue. The company is not going to enjoy that, but there's the truth, because it seems like you can't barbecue without changing the fat. And so that is contributory to inflammation. 4, avoid fruit juices without pulp or with added sugar, because that's just going to increase the fructose. Avoid all highly processed and refined foods due to sugar, artificial sweeteners, and fat content. When I have a birthday, and I never tell anybody my birth date, and I'm writing an example, I'm writing a little article for impacts to pass around if they want to, on the reason I never, ever pay attention to my actual birth date, because it also affects this. So on my birthday, which I celebrate with a few friends, not necessarily on the day, but sometime around there if I'm home, I have a friend who loves to make tiramisu. Well, I used to love tiramisu and probably eat half of the tiramisu in the next week. I have 2 small bites because I honor that he's willing to make it for me. But after 2 bites, your taste buds are simply functioning from memory. So you're just eating because you remember how good the first 2 bites were. So if you do want to have a little dessert, 2 bites, eaten very slowly, is what you want to aim for. Avoid fast foods of any kind and the paper they're wrapped in, because that paper is full of PFAS. Those substances that you never get rid of. Hundreds of years and they're still in the environment. Those toxic forever, as we say. Number 7, avoid red meat. Avoid any processed meats because they've got sulfites in them. And that increases your risk. Avoid saturated, hydrogenated, trans fats, and again, all fried foods. And if you want to make gravy and things like that, you can start with a vegetable, what would you call it? A broth, yeah. You could start with a vegetable broth, and you can give that sautéed effect without high heat and without, the fats that usually go along with it. You can do a lot of things just by a few substitutions. Avoid water in thin plastic bottles because the PFAS chemicals leach into really thin plastic, and you don't want those in your brain and body. People are sometimes very kind and say, here, have a bottle of water, and it's that thin plastic stuff. When it's done, you can suck the air out and it'll collapse. And I say, I carry my own water, and I carry my H water in stainless steel containers. And yes, some of the hydrogen may, burn off, but it's also very, very pure. And so that's all I want to drink. Now here's a good one. I bet you everybody in this room almost has some type of aluminum foil in their house. Dump it. Avoid any type of aluminum touching your food. The researchers are not saying it causes an Alzheimer's. They're saying that in every single brain that has been analyzed, it contained aluminum. So you don't want to increase that. That means avoiding aluminum cookware unless it's ceramic coated and it says free of PFAS, PFOS, PFOA, etc. And you can find that. And that's now what I'm doing, and I have no aluminum foil in my house. I have Pyrex glass with a lid, and something that I would ordinarily wrap in tinfoil goes in there and put the lid on and bake it. Avoid acetate that's found in vinegar. This was the hardest one for me, but I did it. I used to love, anything with vinegar. You go out to a restaurant and they bring you a little container of oil and what? Balsamic vinegar. And I had some good balsamic vinegar from that, factory on my way to Portland when I visited my cousin. Well, your taste buds change every 2 weeks. And I just quit buying balsamic vinegar, and I don't even miss it. Why would you want to avoid that? Because it's linked with inflammation in the brain's astrocyte cells, those little cells we talked about, that's linked with creating the tangles in Alzheimer's. I mean, who knew? That has been my most difficult one. I never smoked. I drank lots of water. I exercise, but I don't over-exercise. But that one was hard. But it's amazing. Alzheimer's is partly a mindset. And I don't want to risk it. I can live without balsamic vinegar. Drink the purest water that you possibly can find. I will give up almost anything to get a product that will purify the water down to those many, whatever you call them, molecules. Because The EPA found PFAS chemicals in all but one tap water system that was tested in the United States, and they did a lot of them. Which means that I don't want any of those in my body, because one thing will not give you Alzheimer's, but one thing won't prevent it either. It's the accumulation of the studies that you're willing to follow. And the EPA was only looking for PFAS chemicals, but there are 60,000 chemicals used in the United States today in manufacturing. EPA only tests for 91 of them. So there's what, 59,000 plus chemicals they don't even test for. So you want to drink the purest water you can obtain. Now, what are some of the contaminants that we find in tap water based on the EPA study? Well, aluminum, duh. You don't want aluminum if you want to prevent Alzheimer's. Ammonia, arsenic, I like that one, slowly killing yourself. Fluoride, now the dental, really hate to say this because it's not popular, but most dentists want you to take a dose of fluoride when you go to get your teeth cleaned. I told my dentist, I'm not taking fluoride, and my dentist says, well, then I don't want you as a patient. I said, fine, I'll find somebody else. Found a lovely woman. She gives you your choice. While fluoride probably did help a little bit with cavities, fluoride is not what you want if you're trying to prevent Alzheimer's. Lead, silica, nitrates. We've talked about nitrates with meats. Looks like I got silica in there twice, because silica, comes from groundwater often, and you don't want silica in your body. PFAS, certainly. Any number of microorganisms, oh my goodness. They can be bacteria, they can be viruses, they can be fungus. So we're looking at things like E. coli, Legionella, Giardia, Salmonella, Norovirus, Campylobacter, I gave up there. That's a lot of stuff in drinking water that's supposed to be pure. 2022, last fall, multiple mice studies showed that hydrogen-rich water, did you hear what I just said? Hydrogen-rich water in mice and rat studies prevented the loss of those synapses, prevented death of the neurons, inhibited the development of plaques and tau tangles, improved brain energy, metabolism disorders, intestinal flora imbalances, and reduced inflammatory reactions. That's staggering, in my brain's opinion. It suggests, at the bottom of the research, this suggests that hydrogen-rich water is an effective hydrogen donor that inhibits, or that exhibits, it inhibits the development of Alzheimer's, and it exhibits the potential to treat it. So, this is my brain's opinion. If lifestyle changes in hydrogen water potentially can treat Alzheimer's, the beginning research that says it's possible to treat it, I think it's possible to prevent it. But that means you're going to get serious about the research and what it shows and what you need to get out of your life. And for me, giving up balsamic vinegar, drinking hydrogen water, a few things like that, that's nothing when you look at the devastation that occurs with dementias, including Alzheimer's. So that's the latest research I've got for you. And when I read this, this last piece, I just got that information, a week ago. When I look at that, I'm going, finally they're figuring out that the choices you make every single day, your lifestyle, really, down the line, can treat and I think prevent, in most cases, Alzheimer's. And to me, that's where I'm going. Okay, what's next? Who's on next?
You have one more slide.
Oh, I got one more slide?
Did you want to answer questions? She's got one more slide.
I got one more slide. What does that say about my brain? Okay, let's do one more slide. All right, here's the formula. Oh yes, I do remember writing this, but I was so overwhelmed with the fact that Alzheimer's may be preventable that that's all I see in my brain. You know, I have family members that died of Alzheimer's. And I can list for you, if I wanted to, those 12 factors that increase your risk. And most of them have, almost all of them. And we didn't know. And they didn't live nearly long enough for me. All right, the formula. 1, identify what you can control and control it. Can you control how much high fructose corn syrup and regular table sugar you eat? Yeah, in the main you can. So are you controlling it? Identify what you can't control and avoid or minimize it. You know, when I travel, I carry my little 1-glass hydrogen generator with me because I can't take a whole big machine. Which means that I got to take adapters and so on, depending where I am in the world. But I will not drink tap water unless there's no other water available, and then I'm going to drink water, period, because I can't afford dehydration. Because if you get dehydrated, the water inside the cells makes the cells shrink because there's not enough water to keep them all plumped up. And eventually it pulls the tissue away from the skull, which is very ugly. And the brain generates every bit of electricity that you have to send messages throughout the brain. It is just like they build a dam and, the water pours over it and it generates electricity. Well, the water that goes in and out of the cells creates electricity in the brain, and it stores it as ATP. And it uses that to run all the brain functions. So, if the only thing I had on the planet where I was tap water, I drink it. But boy, not if I can help it. So figure out what you can't control and try to avoid it or have the least amount possible. Develop a plan to manage what could not be controlled or was not controlled. So I developed a plan to manage balsamic vinegar. I send it packing. That's not a problem for me. Read labels. I mean, I have reading glasses and they're fine, but I go into a store and I pick something up and the ingredients look like just so many dots because the manufacturers don't want you to know what's in the product or you wouldn't buy it. So carry a magnifying glass, and I don't care if people think I'm a super centenarian already. I'm there with my magnifying glass, and I'm reading the ingredients, and I go, oh my goodness, I used to eat this stuff. Okay, well, I'm not going there. But you won't know if you can't read the ingredients. And finally, Nobody can make you do this but you. Alter your lifestyle choices based on current research. And that's why I started by saying, in order to slow down or prevent the development of Alzheimer's disease, most people will have to do what? Alter their lifestyle, and that begins with the mindset. And you can absolutely do it.